At the turn of the last century, in the year 1900, long before cell phones, long before video footage, people had to make their way with very little technology. And it is precisely this, and this alone, that brings us to today's mystery. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse. An old lighthouse, soaked in mystery. But what mystery, you ask? Somewhere off the coast of Scotland, there sits a small island. A small island with a big secret. Just what, may we ask, is this island hiding? The island Eileen Moore. 3 men, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald William MacArthur. All are charged with operating the lighthouse. MacArthur was known as a tough, grizzled man who could, by all accounts, take care of himself. But let's move forward to December 15th, when a steamer ship notices there's no light coming from the lighthouse. Perhaps it was poor weather conditions. 2 days later, December 18th, the message is passed on to the Northern Lighthouse Board of Scotland. On December 20th, a relief ship was sent, Hesperus. However, due to poor weather, the ship does not arrive. It does not arrive until December 26th, almost a week late. When the crew finally dropped anchor, the relief keeper noticed there was no flag on the flagpole. There were no provision boxes anywhere on the landing stage for restocking. A rather shocking observation, to say the least. Things took a turn for the worst, and Captain James Harvey blew the ship's whistle. A whistle so loud your ears may begin to bleed. But there was no response. He then fired a flare, yet no one appeared. A small boat with Joseph Moore at the helm was sent to the shore. As a relief, he was sent alone. Joseph began yelling. He began yelling for the men, yet no one yelled back. The 3 men were nowhere to be found. They had seemingly vanished into thin air. Upon his arrival to the lighthouse, he found the main entrance gate closed. And then the main door was also closed. The beds were unmade. The clock in the lighthouse stopped. He then saw a set of raincoats, also known as oilskins, in 1900, meaning at least one man had left without being properly dressed for poor weather. This was a rather profound and strange situation, causing Joseph Moore to worry due to the simple fact poor weather conditions had been recorded in the lighthouse log. How then, we must ask, just how does a man go out in gale force winds, torrential rain, crashing waves, and not freeze to death? For it was December, when temperatures drop to freezing levels at night. Joseph headed back to the landing and returned to the ship. He then took the second mate and a seaman back to the shore and back up to the lighthouse. The 3 men began a deeper search for what had transpired in the darkness of the night. They recognized the kerosene lamps. They had been cleaned and refilled with oil. Joseph Moore and 3 volunteers were then left on the island to work the lighthouse. The Hesperus and Captain Harvey returned to the land and sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board, dated 26th of December, 1900, stating, "A rather dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were all stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows they must have been, blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane. Back at the island, the three men discovered more clues. There were two landings, an east and a west. And although the east was fine, the western landing had damage from a recent storm, indicating a box at around 108 feet above sea level had broken. It had been broken and its contents were strewn all about. Iron railings were bent over. The iron railway by itself. The path was wrenched out of its concrete. A rock more than 2,000 pounds had been moved on top of the cliff for 200 feet above sea level. Grass, soil had been ripped away, stripped from the earth. More than 30 feet from the edge of a steep cliff. What monstrosity could do such a thing? Just what, may we ask? Perhaps a massive rogue sea wave. Perhaps rain, water, and wind of unimaginable strength. The volunteers had never seen such damage on the island before. On December 29th, Robert Muirhead of the NLB conducted his own investigation to unravel this untimely mystery on Eileen Moor. He noticed the logs claimed severe winds on December 12th, and for unknown reasons, Ducat had become very quiet over the last few days. Donald MacArthur was crying at some point. Perhaps they missed being home, for it is often we find ourselves in the darkest places, while being confined to some small building, working overtime in the darkness of the night, far away from our loved ones. By December 13th, the logs claimed the weather was still horrendous, and they were all praying for it to end. However, the strangest part of this, there was no bad weather recorded between December 12th and December 14th. At least not on land or offshore there. So just what were they actually seeing out there? Further investigation claimed these logs were actually fakes. But were they? This leaves us more confused. The investigation came to a conclusion. Muirhead, believing two men, Ducat and Marshall, had went down to the landing stage to secure mooring and landing ropes. When out of nowhere, a massive rush of water crashed into the landing and swept them away, out to sea, never to be seen again. The geos on the island would explain how they had not seen it coming. But these men had experience. Why would they put themselves in such a situation, a position, if you will, in which they could be sucked out the dangers of the sea? Now this would account for two raincoats being gone. Meanwhile, MacArthur, the occasional, he had stayed behind. As the rule is, there should always be one man manning the lighthouse. However, when the men had not returned on time, MacArthur may have become worried. He then perhaps left the lighthouse in a hurry when he heard the wave crashing. In a desperate attempt to save the other men, he ran out of the lighthouse without his raincoat on to fetch the missing men who had not returned yet. He also believed, in accordance with the lighthouse logs, the men were likely there until at least Saturday, December 15th. Nevertheless, the mystery remains, for the bodies were never found. One may think or assume some remnant or vestige of their bodies would be floating at sea, or washed ashore perhaps, but this simply is not the case. After the men vanished, stories filled the newspapers all over the British Isles. One story claimed a giant sea serpent came ashore and devoured the men. Another story claimed that the men had debt and hated their lives, and conspired to vanish and start new lives over, perhaps with a secret mistress or some love affair. But again, many doubt this theory, and some older seamen claim there were ghost ships. These ghost ships came ashore in the wee hours of the night, taking the men's souls and leaving their bodies floating in the sea. Other, perhaps more plausible theories point out the silverware, that the silverware was clean and it was all put away, proving, perhaps, whatever happened after dark. But if so, why would the men risk going into the darkness, the night, in high winds and ice-cold rain, crashing waves? No, they were too smart for that. Meanwhile, others claim the fact that the beds were unmade, that it proves it must have happened upon them waking up, or perhaps in the middle of the night or the early morning. But then why? Just why? If this was so sudden, would 2 men leave, and the 3rd man also eventually leave, but without his raincoat? Last but not least, there's talk of MacArthur. Grizzled old MacArthur, being a brawler, a fighter, a strong, tough guy, and sometimes an angry madman, that he may have provoked a fight, and in doing so killed the 2 men and then jumped to his own death, or tried to swim ashore or to a boat to escape his punishment or future life in prison. And some say, perhaps, they found something of great value, and other evil men, if you will, came ashore looking for that precious cargo, and thusly murdered the lighthouse keepers to take whatever it was they had back. However, it is easy to see certain basic facts do not add up. They do not add up to a hill of beans in this dark and murky mystery. The gatehouse door was closed. The door to the actual lighthouse itself was also closed. If a man was in a hurry to warn or save his friends from rogue waves, would he simply and slowly take the time to close both doors? Meanwhile, leave his raincoat behind and become soaked, then freeze in the cold rain? The answer is most likely not. What type of grifter, gumshoe, grabbing at goofy theories would believe any of this makes sense? Perhaps there's indeed something far more sinister that transpired in the lighthouse that night. All work and no play maketh a man crazy, and it is that craziness that leads us down a dark, lonely road in the middle of the night, somewhere between here and into the unknown. It's a warm summer day. A young man, slightly drunk from the night before, is heading home. He decides to take a shortcut, but in doing so, he becomes lost and comes upon an abandoned group of buildings. This relic is Willard Insane Asylum. Although creepy when seen in the daylight, at night, this abandoned asylum is a terrifying scene to behold. The type of place you thought only existed in movies. As he runs through the asylum grounds, he looks up to a broken window. Standing there peering into the darkness is the ghost of a former patient who ended his life by jumping out that very window. This young man vows to never return to this abandoned place with a dark history. This is an old tale that is often told of abandoned places, as a warning to those who wish to step back into time and witness what was once a fully functional insane asylum for the chronically insane patients who now haunt the grounds and buildings and dark, dreary basements of Willard Asylum. In the mid-1800s, New York City was overrun with homeless people, some struggling to survive and work. Meanwhile, many of those poor souls suffered from horrendous diseases and injuries, conditions that would better be treated in a state-ran hospital, like Willard Asylum. Before Abraham Lincoln died from assassination, according to a few sources, he himself had signed a letter agreeing to see Willard Insane Asylum built for the chronically insane. In 1869, Willard Asylum took on its very first patient, a lady by the name of Mary Rope. Her condition was recorded as somewhat deformed and quite demented. She spent over 10 years suffering in shelters around New York, often called almshouses. But even more interesting than the opening of the asylum would be the stories that came with the patients. In the mid to late 1800s, human life was cheap and of little value to most. If you were burdened or mentally ill or could not physically care for yourself, people were cruel enough to put you on a train with a one-way ticket and no money, or drop you off in a city by a stagecoach and gallop away, never looking back. When word of this new state-ran hospital for the chronically ill, chronically insane became well known, the patients began piling up like a stack of pancakes outside the asylum doors. But these were not pleasant or happy endings. Willard Asylum was a dumping ground for those in need of help. Many stories of Willard Asylum and Willard Asylum patients go as far as claiming some patients were dropped off in animal crates. Some were chained or shackled because they would bite their caregivers. One worker at the asylum claimed one man suffering from lunacy was dropped off in the middle of the night and chained to a stake someone had hammered into the ground so he could not escape back to wherever he had come from. Overall, in the beginning, according to many that had worked there, Willard Asylum was a positive place and better alternative for many of its patients than the situation they were previously in. The asylum was split into two sides for male and female, and two sides for violent and non-violent patients. The asylum had its own land to grow crops. These crops were tended by the patients themselves. Most of the patients had free will to walk and roam around the asylum grounds and fresh air. Eventually, many other features and common places would be added to Willard Asylum, like a movie theater, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and other things and places. During the summer months, many patients also took part in what was basically summer camp activities as part of their therapy and rehabilitation. Alas, despite the will of good women and men working there, Willard Asylum slowly grew darker and darker over the decades, as many asylum workers could not handle the daily stresses from the patients. Despite all the common areas for leisure and fun, the state-ran hospital also had wings in the buildings for electroshock therapy, a highly controversial physical therapy in which a patient is strapped down to a bed and electrodes are wrapped around their skull as electric pulses go through their brain. Described by many that experienced it as extremely painful and borderline torture, as if electroshock therapy could somehow reset the proper brainwave patterns so patients would become healthy again. But often, many inexperienced doctors in the early 20th century utilizing these practices would sadistically do it to patients who assaulted or injured nurses, doctors, and orderlies working at Willard Insane Asylum. Willard also had operating theaters for medical students, a morgue, and even a cemetery, which now is filled with thousands and thousands of patients who once walked the halls there. If that isn't enough to make you feel creeped out, there's more. Experimental psychiatric drugs, horrendous medical procedures like lobotomies, often botched and sent the patient into a deeper and deeper psychosis. The darkest of all, the personal effects left behind by the patients, whose families left them behind and never claimed their belongings. There is a dark, rotten attic somewhere in Willard Insane Asylum, filled with thousands and thousands of suitcases, brought by the patients and forgotten to time. In 1972, Geraldo Rivera, along with many other journalists in the 1970s, began exposing the horrendous, overcrowded conditions of insane asylums in the 1970s, which had gone on for almost 100 years. Thereafter, many began closing their doors, shutting down or severely limiting how many people would be cared for at these insane asylums. Massive reform in state-ran hospitals took place. So if you ever find yourself trying to take a shortcut through an abandoned place with a dark history, before you take another step, perhaps you should consider turning back, so you don't end up as a missing person on a poster stapled to a post in the middle of nowhere. If you could step back into time just 100 years while sitting in your house, you would perhaps see an open field wherein the sun is shining and animals are roaming, or perhaps something dreary, maybe a fog that slowly rolls over a graveyard, or maybe something you wish you would never see again. For it is often said there are things better left alone than brought to light. Time is a funny thing. What may feel like a lifetime to one man feels like the blink of an eye to another. Regardless, it is precisely time we must keep, as a shepherd keeps watch over his flock. But sometimes this is not the case. Sometimes forgetting the past means we may dig it up, but digging up things that should stay buried is never a good idea. The early settlers came across what the Native Americans referred to as Indian burial grounds. They were a sacred place that no one was supposed to desecrate or build upon. The Egyptians and many other cultures also had beliefs that someone should never step foot upon where we lay the dead. I remember when I was a young boy, someone had died, but this didn't mean much to me because, well, I didn't know the person who had died. My friends and I, foolishly, were giggling when we were told how the man had passed away, which was rather strange. It was then and there an old bearded man came up to us. He reached down and sunk his claws into my arm like a vulture grasping its prey. He looked me in the eyes and uttered one sentence. "Never speak ill of the dead. Never speak ill of the dead." He said it with a thick British accent, as if he had come from medieval times. Rarely, but in a few movies and books, did I ever hear this phrase again. However, I took this advice and kept my mouth shut. When someone who perhaps even was a rotten human being died, I thought to myself, well, they are gone and have paid their dues to the Grim Reaper, so let them rest in peace. In that same regard, we honor our loved ones who pass in places we call cemeteries or graveyards. And just like people in medieval times, we bestow ourselves with a sense of humility and silence when we walk amongst the graves of those who have passed. Nevertheless, just as in ancient times, money has corrupted the souls of so many. It is precisely the reward of gold and other acquisitions that will turn an angel into a demon, a knight in shining armor into a villain, or in this case, a simple construction company into a nightmare. For future homeowners in Newport subdivision in Crosby, Texas. There was a small town outside of Houston, Texas at the turn of the last century. It was occupied mainly by freed slaves. Different parts of what is now the Newport subdivision was built on top of a graveyard called Black Hope Cemetery. The last bodies were buried in the 1930s. However, there was a massive fire which partially engulfed what was the Black Hope Cemetery and the surrounding area in the 1970s. Many people in the area forgot what the land was even used for, but a few. And according to the county law, it was free and clear to be sold for real estate. In 1983, 2 different families moved into these new homes that were freshly built. Hoping for the best, families had begun to relax and enjoy the new home. One of the families, the Haneys, according to Unsolved Mysteries and Robert Stack, loved the area so much he decided to dig a hole for a swimming pool. One of the contractors told him his plumbing had been rerouted, which meant there was something in the ground that someone thought should be avoided. But what? What could be hiding under the ground that was horrible or dangerous? Perhaps a sinkhole, buried pile of farm machinery. The homeowner would soon find out. As they were working, an older gentleman came up to them and pointed at a tree and said, "There are 2 people buried down there." Using heavy digging equipment, the men continued to dig until they ran across fragments of a pine board. Mr. Haney lifted the boards and saw 2 dead bodies slowly decaying in the old wooden coffin. It was after this rather strange event, digging for a pool, events began occurring in the new home. First, one of the clocks began illuminating with a strange blue glow, then allegedly shooting sparks or plasma out of the clock itself. The paranormal activity continued, as there would be cold spots while walking throughout the house. Strange voices, even the smell of coffee when no one was making coffee. Sometimes the toilets would start flushing by themselves, or an ice cold draft would blow across Ms. Haneys' face. TVs, the radios would begin playing without being plugged in. It all culminated one night when they heard a door open and slam, assuming someone had come into the house, yet no one was there. Miss Haney thought it was perhaps the sliding glass door. To her horror, there was no one there, and all of the doors were locked. One morning, Miss Haney could not find her shoes. She looked everywhere. Later that day, while strolling through her backyard, her and Mr. Haney saw something red sitting atop the freshly reburied grave. It was Miss Haney's shoes. Coincidentally, that day marked the birthday of the lady buried there with her husband next to her. It is said perhaps the ghost of the husband laid the shoes there for a birthday present. They referred to this constant, eerie, and gloomy presence as a chill in the air, or the feeling of being watched. Across the street, another family known as the Williams had also moved in. Miss Williams noticed early on there were two strange sinkholes by a tree, with an arrow pointing down. She was told there were also two bodies down there. Upon trying to plant flowers anywhere on her property, the flowers would instantly begin molting, then die. Ms. Williams was in shock, utterly devastated upon learning her home, too, was built upon the old graveyard. According to Unsolved Mysteries, she is quoted as saying she felt as though the graves had been desecrated, a sin she felt guilt for. Her young granddaughter, who came to live with her, noticed the house was filled with cold spots. Some of these spots would give off a stench, as if there was a roadkill nearby. Nevertheless, they could never find where the actual stench emanated from. One sunny afternoon, when Miss Williams and her granddaughter Carly sat upon the bed, they heard a locked door slowly open. Then heavy footsteps began walking down the hallway to the door. A chill ran down Carly's spine. The feeling of terror filled the room, as though someone was waiting outside the door for them. After several minutes, she crept towards the door to look down the hallway. To her disbelief, there was no one there. The living nightmare in Newport continued as the torment, the hauntings, continued to wake them in sheer terror. One night, when Mr. Williams arrived home, he noticed what looked like shadow people, or the outline of faint, dark ghosts. They seemed to hang in the air in a very ethereal manner. The shadow people then slowly moved towards his bedroom, where his wife, Ms. Williams, was sleeping. In a mad dash, Mr. Williams tried to jump directly into the shadow demons to remove them from the bedroom. Both families began to feel depressed, scared, and in a constant state of fear. They tried suing the developer company, but in a strange turn of fate, the family had lost their case in a reversal and claimed bankruptcy, lost their savings, their house, and many other things indeed. The other family, the Williams, said they would prove to a court that there were graves. All they did was move the headstones and left the bodies, so she began digging them up with the help of her daughter, who had a heart condition. While digging, the daughter felt ill and began having a heart attack, only to die days later. Was this a warning from the grave, perhaps? Do not dig us up. Let us rest in peace. After this horrendous tragedy, the Williams left the neighborhood and sold the house. Ms. Williams is quoted as saying, "If they would not have left, they may have perished also." So I say back to you, never speak ill of the dead, never trample on a grave, and never ever build anything upon the dead. In the early 1980s, a few families thought they had found their dream home, but the dreams were shattered when they took a detour into the unknown. There's a small town somewhere in Iowa. If you had no business going there, you would likely never know it even existed. Right before you pass into Nebraska and the endless cornfields, you may find yourself at the edge of this little town as you head out west in search of gold. But if you stop too long, you may find this town has secrets. Secrets best left unknown. The town is called Council Bluffs, Iowa. Although it has some beautiful sights and kind and warm-hearted people, there lies a small patch of darkness in the middle of the city in an old, dusty parking lot. Once a thriving grocery store filled with smiling customers, kids running through the candy aisles, and hard-working people stocking the shelves. One of these hard-working people went home one day. His name was Larry Moncada. He was just 25 years old, and according to his parents, overall, a happy, hard-working fellow. But a dark cloud had begun hanging over Larry's head at work that day. As he ventured out to traverse the landscape on his way home, this dark cloud followed him. It was a cold and gloomy November. Thanksgiving was days away, as his mother would remember, a day often celebrated when families get together and their hearts are as light as a feather, as they share warm mugs of apple cider by the warmth of a fire. But rather unfortunately, this is no fairy tale. The year in question is 2009. This is a tale I can barely tell. This young man's mother hangs her head in sorrow as she begins explaining to the police a rather strange story that took place. A story that not only came upon abruptly, but just as well ended even more abruptly. Larry had told his mother he had begun hearing voices. The voices told him rather strange things. They told him to eat sugar, and perhaps then eating sugar would calm his heartbeat down. The voices made him feel like someone was following him. But who, just who, would be following Larry? Did something occur at the grocery store? Did Larry have enemies? Perhaps even a customer he had a rather horrible interaction with? Such things we may never know, as they, like many memories, will be lost to time, like tears in the rain. There wasn't a solid explanation for Larry's behavior. Perhaps adult-onset schizophrenic symptoms or sleep deprivation from working too much. Regardless, Larry's mother did the best thing she thought she could do and brought him to the doctor. The doctor had prescribed some sort of an antidepressant medication. Larry had begun taking the medication. However, within days, the symptoms were not clearing up. Larry had told his mother and father again he thought he was being followed and kept hearing voices, which seems like classic paranoia. As the cold, dark night drew on, the snow began falling on the city of Council Bluffs, to the point most would call a blizzard. It was getting late, maybe around 6:15 or so. In the northern Midwest, it was already dark outside, and visibility was very low due to the blizzard. Larry had walked into the living room and looked at his mother. He stood there for a moment, barefooted, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and pants. Then all of a sudden, bolted toward the door, as if he was on a mission to save the world, or perhaps running in absolute fear, running away from something only he could see. As he flew out the front door, he vanished into the darkness of the snowfall. He was barefooted. This is what Larry's mother would explain to the police later that night when he had not returned. When they called the police to explain what happened, the mother explained he was paranoid and had begun acting irrationally. The manager said he was not scheduled to work the day he went missing. Fast forward, a search ensues over the town. Posters, radio, news, etc. But no one has seen Larry anywhere, as if he vanished into thin air in the darkness of the night. Weeks go by with nothing. Months go by. Then years. The family begins losing hope, assuming he either ran away on purpose or perished and froze to death in the snowstorm. During the decade from 2009 to 2016, when the grocery store went under and then was closed, customers and a few employees began noticing a rather foul stench. A stench that seemed to hang in the air, then vanish, only to come back minutes or hours later. No one seemed to be able to find where this rather foul odor was emanating from. However, one thing was quite sure. Wherever it was coming from was likely somewhere towards the back of the store. Near the butcher and the meat locker and the frozen goods section, most people assumed it was a turkey or a chicken that had perhaps fallen under the aisles and began slowly rotting, giving off a stench. On occasion, a draft would push the foul air up and around the store. Others began assuming something much, much worse. First, one of the customers had asked if the butchers were cleaning the floors and the freezers. The butcher said, yes, of course, we are cleaning. We're cleaning twice as much, and the stench seems to come and go. Others began thinking perhaps there was some connection between the missing man and the foul odor in the grocery store, but no one was sure. This went on for around 6+ years, till the store finally met its ending and closing in 2016. Fast forward, it is now 2019. An entire decade has passed since Larry Moncada vanished in the darkness of a snowstorm one night, barefooted. The store has been sold or changed hands. A crew is sent to remove the massive 12-foot freezers at the back of the store for repurposing and cleaning. The crew also comments on the foul stench that seems to make their nostrils burn for a moment. Then it dissipates, but it's definitely there. As the crew begins the massive task of moving the giant freezers, they hear something fall to the floor behind the freezers, making a crunching sound, like something shattering or breaking. Assuming they accidentally damaged some of the equipment, one of the men runs behind the freezers to see what broke. As the man stands there, his jaw begins to slowly drop. To his horror, he sees the ghastly remains of a mummified dead body. Laying on the floor, the crew calls the police. Unsure who it is or how long it's been there, it is far too decomposed to get an identification by looking at it. But the dead body has a blue hooded sweatshirt on, just as did Larry when he vanished that day. DNA tests are ran. The police begin investigating. It is a confirmation, an absolute horrendous one. Somehow, at some point, Larry had either walked into the grocery store barefooted, somehow not being noticed, then walked into the back of the storage area, scaled the ladder that led to a 12 feet above the freezer, and for some reason or somehow decided to try to hide behind the freezers, or perhaps slipped and fell in. Meanwhile, he became trapped and likely asphyxiated or went into shock, and hopefully he passed rather quickly. Some say it is also possible he may have died of dehydration after a few days. No one actually knows the cause of his death, or if there was someone else involved in the accident. Nevertheless, it appears to have most likely been just that, an accident. But the mystery remains. What drove Larry to hear voices? Did the medication he was prescribed push him over the edge? And the greatest unanswered question of all, at least in my point of view, how does a barefooted man walk into a grocery store at 6 to 7 p.m. during a blizzard, go completely unnoticed? Even if everyone knew him, wouldn't someone have said, "Hey man, are you okay? You aren't wearing any shoes or a coat. Is everything okay? Maybe there's some extra shoes in the back you could throw on." Larry Moncada was plagued by a short-term mental illness that seems to have come out of nowhere. This illness he described as evil voices, so unbearable he tried to outrun them by bolting out his front door barefoot into a blizzard, then vanished somewhere between here and into the unknown. God bless Larry's family, and I hope they're healing.